This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felten. Kenya has sent troops into Somalia to take on al-Shabaab, an Islamist militia trying to overthrow the UN-backed Somali government. What does Kenya hope to accomplish? And how will the fighting affect refugees fleeing famine in Somalia? Joining us to talk about it is Peter Pham, director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, a Washington-based think tank. And joining us by phone from Nairobi, Kenya, is Gabe Joslow, VOA's East Africa correspondent. How many troops is Kenya sending into Somalia? How big a force?
Well, actually, the Kenyan military has not given out a number of troops that they've sent over the border. I spoke yesterday, though, to a former Army major who said that, according to his information, it's about 6,000 troops that are involved in this operation. That's really on both sides of the border, which is, not a really big number, to tell you the truth.
Although that's a lot larger number than the numbers that had been sort of officially suggested. It had been in the hundreds rather than the thousands.
No, I hadn't heard any numbers really officially suggested. A lot of the campaign has been from the air, a lot of airstrikes, so it's not necessarily coming from a major ground force. So maybe that is, why the numbers might be downplayed a little bit.
Well, Peter Pham, why is Kenya sending troops into Somalia at this point?
Well, certainly the Kenyans have a variety of reasons. They've certainly been provoked. They've faced kidnappings of tourists vacationing near the Somali border, and as well as in Lamu, one of the major tourist sites. And more recently, they faced the kidnapping of 2 aid workers with Médecins Sans Frontières who are working for the relief of Somali refugees near the Dadaab refugee camp. And the reason Kenya had to act, or at least felt it had to act, elections are coming up next year. Politicians don't want to appear weak, unable to defend national territory. The hit to the tourism trade is devastating to the economy. And if anything happens to jeopardize relief efforts, then Kenya faces the possibility that Somalis will have to go deeper into Kenya, which is politically unpalatable, in order to get to relief and assistance.
And Gabe Joslow, there's been a worry that there would be terrorist retaliation against Kenya. And we saw this week 2 grenade attacks and someone arrested for that who claims he's with al-Shabaab.
That's right. Actually, the U.S. Embassy had warned on Saturday, issued a warning to U.S. citizens in the area about possible retaliation, and al-Shabaab had made very explicit threats to that nature. And then there were these 2 attacks just days later. Now, the police in Kenya haven't linked it directly to al-Shabaab. Of course, the suspicions in Kenya and in Nairobi are that this is, these are the attacks that al-Shabaab was promising, and that these were al-Shabaab sympathizers. The evidence isn't entirely there, but certainly the city is on edge a little bit. Somebody was telling me actually just today that they were riding a public bus in the city, and a Somali couple wanted to get on the bus, and the other people on there refused to let them on. So there's just this fear that could turn really sour in this city, and that's certainly a concern among citizens.
Peter Pham, how's this likely to affect the refugees coming from Somalia into Kenya, where you have these vast refugee camps for people fleeing famine? Is the famine in Somalia, with this extra fighting, likely to get worse, or is there a hope that there will be greater access for aid workers if the Kenyans can actually put a dent into al-Shabaab?
Well, immediately, I think this is going to exacerbate the situation. It's certainly going to prevent more refugees from coming, because the fighting taking place in that border area will prevent those seeking help from crossing the border. So we're going to exacerbate the situation within Somalia with people suffering and the inability. It's already difficult to get aid to them in Somalia. The fighting will make it worse. I think Kenya is hoping, they won't say this publicly, but I think they're hoping that if they create a buffer zone, then aid can be delivered to people in Somalia within Somalia without them crossing over. Already the Dadaab refugee camp has become Kenya's 3rd largest city. It's an intolerable situation for our country, and so the Kenyans, I think, are hoping to shift the refugee burden back into Somalia.
Gabe Joslow, what's the sense of where what Kenya is doing fits in with the other efforts against al-Shabaab? You have the Africa Union there fighting against al-Shabaab, and is there going to be cooperation, or are they at odds with one another in this operation?
Well, both Kenya as well as the transitional federal government in Somalia have been giving kind of mixed signals to this account. Somalia, the government there, for the first 2 days that Kenya had launched this incursion into Somali territory, the Somalian government wasn't even acknowledging that it was happening. They were saying there was no violation of their sovereignty, that kind of thing. And even within the Somali government, you're seeing a division between the prime minister and the president in terms of their feelings about this operation. The prime minister is a bit more supportive. The president just the other day released a statement saying that he's against this offensive. And just today, they issued another statement trying to clarify it, to say that we do support the mission, but we want them to work to support TFG troops. So, I'm sorry, that's transitional federal government troops, the soldiers that are part of the Somali government. So there's just so many mixed signals going on. It's hard to figure out, where Kenya is getting its backing from and whether they really are welcome in Somalia. I think the government of Somalia really is trying to defend its sovereignty, to show that it can lead a united Somalia, and so they don't want to create the impression that these invaders are coming in and taking over or trying to set up their own government.
Peter Pham, is the West supporting Kenya in this incursion into Somalia?
I think there's certainly some coordination. There have been reports of French ships shelling the Somali coast to assist the Kenyan advance. On the other hand, I think there's reason to be nervous. Just when Shabaab is weakened by the famine, by its defeats in Mogadishu, now the Kenya invasion is potentially handing Shabaab once again the nationalist flag to wave. So I think a number of governments, including the U.S. government, are also taking a step of reserve and seeing if this is really a commitment to carry it through.
And Gabe Joslow, what's the regional reaction there in Africa? Is there support for Kenya on this?
Certainly within within Kenya there is sort of a support for this operation. The newspaper headlines are all very positive, touting all of the military successes. There are some speculation that Uganda is a little concerned that since Uganda supplies so many troops to AMISOM, which is the AU force that's supporting the TFG within Somalia, there's some speculation that Uganda might be upset about this and wants to play a bigger role itself. But for the most part, there's certainly regional understanding that Somalia is a threat to the entire region, or that instability in Somalia is a threat, and that al-Shabaab really does pose a great risk to neighboring countries. So, certainly the broader goal of eliminating that terror group is supported across East Africa. But people are really watching to see what this Kenyan military incursion is going to become.
Well, Peter Pham, we only have about a minute left, but of course the greatest impact may be on the people in Somalia who are already suffering from a terrible drought that has turned into a famine. What can be done at this point to ease their burden, to make it less likely that many more thousands of people are going to die?
Well, ultimately what can be done is put an end to al-Shabaab's reign of terror, its malfeasance in Somalia. My concern is, however, that the Kenyans may have stirred up a hornet's nest, but they haven't committed enough resources or don't have enough resources to carry it through. We have to remember that just a decade and a half ago, 36,000 UN troops couldn't carry out this mission. And although the numbers Gabe has given us are relatively higher than the ones I've heard, how can one expect 6,000 Kenyans to do what 36,000 blue helmets couldn't do? It's delusional.
And does Kenya have the experience in its military to do these kinds of operations? It's
got a very professional military by African standards, but it may not have committed enough forces to actually carry out this mission.
Afraid that's going to have to be the last word for today. We're out of time. But I'd like to thank Peter Pham, who's director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. And in Nairobi, Gabe Joslow is VOA's East Africa correspondent. Thanks so much for joining us today. Before we go, I'd like to invite you to send us your questions or comments. You can reach us through our website at www.voanews.com/ontheline. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you join us again next week for On the Line.